haven't played in a long time.
All right, everyone. We are going to get started with our next session here. Just go. Okay. It's Holland Perryman here again, Conroy Center Enter, and welcome back to the Pat Conroy Center's 4th annual Lowcountry Book Club Convention, being held this year in partnership with ETV Lowcountry and NeverMore Books, and with the generous support of the Pulpwood Queens Book Club. Thanks once again to everyone who is joining us here in ETV Lowcountry studio and everyone watching from home. Our final presenter is New York Times best-selling horror novelist Grady Hendrix. Mr. Hendrix will be discussing his newest novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which was based on his mother's long-running book club in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where he was raised. This novel is also an official selection of the Pulpwood Queens Book Club. Mr. Hendrix is also the Bram Stoker award-winning author of Paperbacks from Hell, and the Shirley Jackson and Locust Award nominated author of Horror Store, My Best Friend's Exorcism, and We Sold Our Souls. Our Conroy Center Executive Director, Jonathan Haupt, had the opportunity to review Mr. Hendrix's new novel for the Charleston Post and Courier, and he said this: "The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires will find a deservedly welcoming readership among book club enthusiasts, fans of sophisticated horror fiction, and those familiar with the remarkable real women of Mount Pleasant on whom Hendrix characters are based. Moreover, the novel offers us an affirmation of maternal tenacity and a timely call to tend to others in times of crisis, even and especially against seemingly insurmountable odds." Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hendrix.
Thanks, y'all. I'm glad this is called a session, like a torture session. I'm sure that's how everyone's going to feel in just a minute. So I'd like to sort of start by there has been some conversation that this is based on my mother's book club. And I guess that's true to some extent. I grew up in Mount Pleasant I sometimes say Charleston. It drives people from Charleston crazy, as they'll point out. Mount Pleasant is not Charleston. But everyone in my books, every person, everyone, every animal, every squirrel is based on someone real. It might be someone I've known all my life. It might just be someone I see walking down the street or on the subway that morning. By the time they get onto the page, they are totally and completely unrecognizable. So my mom does have a book club. This is not her book club. This is a very different book club. And I think where it's different is a little bit interesting and sort of gives a way into talking about Charleston and Mount Pleasant and vampires and the 90s, because the book is set in the 90s. So the short version, if you haven't seen it, is Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is, as you probably guessed by the title, a book that involves book clubs, the South, and vampires. It's about a book club in the early 90s that's devoted to true crime that doesn't call itself a book club, because to them, book clubs are big formal affairs and they're just a couple of women who happen to like reading. They avoid the sort of things that scare and intimidate them about a book club, like having to read the great works of Western literature, as some book clubs set out to do, by just claiming they're not a book club. They don't have a name, they meet sporadically, but they also read true crime. And at some point, a man moves into the neighborhood named James Harris, who I think people who are Shirley Jackson fans might recognize the name, moves into the neighborhood, and they begin to suspect, one of them in particular, Patricia Campbell, begins to suspect that he might be a serial killer or a criminal or maybe even a vampire. And what follows then is kind of a love letter written in poisoned ink about growing up in the 90s in Mount Pleasant. My mom's book club has been around for, I think they're celebrating their 42nd year this year. So I'm 47. They've been around almost as long as I've been alive. I think I don't have memories that are coherent from before they existed. And for my entire life, I have absolutely hated my mom's book club. Growing up, they were the worst plague ever inflicted. In fact, when we did, the plagues in ancient Egypt in Sunday school, I expected that one of them would be my mom's book club descending on Egypt to make everyone listen to their loud laughter, to be banished to bed early, to have to look at cake and treats in the fridge that I wasn't allowed to touch. And then as I got older and turned into a teenager, my loathing only intensified. I felt like these women were just a bunch of loud, shallow, big mouths. They had nothing to offer. They talked too much. They laughed too loud. The books they read were ridiculous. No one knows contempt the way a teenager knows contempt. And I displayed all the contempt I could for my mom's book club. So I got older and matured some, as it happens to everyone. I started to know the women in my mom's book club, not just as so-and-so's mom or the woman who was my math tutor, but I began to realize that they were human beings. And I got to develop a relationship with many of them as an adult. And I realized that like any human being, they had challenging lives that were difficult and full of tragedy and weirdness, the way everyone does. And I realized that there was more to them than met the eye. It's one of those things that happens as you get older. You start to realize that other people are as interesting and complicated and put upon as you find yourself. Every teenager is a self-pitying, self-obsessed narcissist, but hopefully as you get older, that obsession spreads to other people, and you maybe feel pity for them as well. And as I got to know these women, I realized that one of the things that they had that I had done to them, that kind of the world did to them, is it felt like it had their number. It felt like that what they saw on the surface was everything there was to see. It was dismissive of them. There's this image of Southern housewives, or housewives in general, women in general, but particularly when you reduce it down to Southern housewives, that people feel like they know what they are. Soft country accents, big hair, they eat chocolate and talk about sex in embarrassing but not R-rated ways. They drink white wine, they laugh loudly and read silly books and romance novels. This is not entirely inaccurate, but it is a part of the portrait of who these women are. They're people like everyone else. And that stereotype has allowed people to feel very smug about them. One of the things I've had to be careful to do when I'm talking about this book is, I said in the first few interviews I was doing for it, it's about women, housewives, women who don't work. And what I realized was these women do work. They just don't have 9-to-5 jobs where they're paid a paycheck at the end of the week. And the work they do because of that is very, very different. And it gives them a very different perspective on the world. I grew up in the 70s and 80s in Mount Pleasant. It was an enormously safe place to live. It was also a place where everyone saw everything. We wrote down the license plate, or our parents wrote down the license plates of strange cars, just in case there was a break-in later on, they'd be able to give something to the police. If you were looking for someone's house and you drove around too many times, someone would inevitably flag you down and ask if they could help you. Not so much to help you, but to make sure you weren't up to anything seedy and disreputable. We had elaborate back histories for everyone who lived around us. We had elaborate rumor mills and stories and webs of intrigue about the interior of everyone's house. We would know a little bit about someone's house, say your sister babysat for them and saw them a tiny amount. And from that, we'd extrapolate large volumes about how they raised their children and the choices they made in their lives and whether those were good or bad, or they should be doing differently and better. One of the things I remember the most, though, from growing up was that on the weekends, the neighborhood was a normal neighborhood. But during the weekdays, if you were homesick from school or in the summer, it became this kingdom of women. The men were all going to town to work. I'm sure some women did too, but we didn't notice them. The people we knew were mostly moms. And this neighborhood would become full of kids and women. And if there was a guy there was a bachelor who moved in or something like that, they'd be a subject of intense interest because they were there when they shouldn't be. They were a nocturnal animal who was awake during the daylight hours. It was bizarre and strange. And that's partly where James Harris and the fascination people have for him in the book comes from. But another place it comes from is thinking about these women and their lives. I realized that the job they had to raise us, it really boiled down to something very simple. Their job, of course, they wanted us to grow up and live our dreams and, go to a good college and not embarrass them in public and all these things. But the essential job of a parent was to keep us alive, to keep us respirating, and to keep most of our arms and legs intact. And so one of the things I also realize is for these women, their job, what's important isn't your job title, as it would be if you worked 9 to 5 and got a paycheck at the end of the week. It wasn't your size of your paycheck or how much money you made. That was someone else's business. What was important was knowledge. You needed to know things. You needed to know what to do if your daughter ate 6 AA batteries. You needed to know what to do if your son insisted on drawing swastikas on all his school notebooks in 3rd grade. You need to know what to do if your daughter decided to stop eating when she turned 14 years old. You had to ask people. You needed people who had that knowledge, because that knowledge was more valuable than money. And the other thing you needed, which went hand in hand in that, was a social network. It was who you knew. You wanted to get your kids to the good pediatrician. You wanted to get them into the good kindergarten. You wanted to know your neighbors, because you might need someone to watch your kid if you had to run your other child into the emergency room to get 6 AA batteries taken out of her stomach. Knowing people and getting information became what was important, more important than money, more important than a job title, more important than prestige. And so these women became very observant about the world around them. They knew who knew what. They knew who was doing what. Looking at my neighborhood where I grew up, which seemed like sort of an idyllic candy land as a kid, knowing these women as adults and looking at the neighborhood through their eyes, I realized that it was far from idyllic. It was like every neighborhood: divorce, near divorce, affairs, alcoholism, substance abuse, domestic violence. All this stuff ran rampant the same way it does everywhere. I had never seen it because I was a kid, because that's one of the things our parents protect us from. They protect us from that knowledge. And that's what teenage years are about, right? You're sick of the protection. You're sick of the knowledge being kept from you. You're ready to face it, or you think you are. But your parents know that you're ready to face some of it, but not all of it. And that's where the tension comes in. That and the fact that your parents are just unreasonable and unfair and won't let you dress like the other kids. And so looking at my old neighborhood through these women's eyes, it was like seeing a world I thought I knew flip through the looking glass. Everything was in reverse. It looked roughly the same, but essentially was different. It was fascinating to me, which is one reason I wrote this book. The other reason I wrote this book is because I wanted to look at adult friendship. I'd written a book called My Best Friend's Exorcism that's also set in the old village. And it's about teenage friendship. And one of the things that's interesting with teenage friendship is it runs hot. I remember being a kid, and the reason I wrote My Best Friend's Exorcism about teenage friendship is because I came up with the title before I came up with the book. And it was a good title, and my publisher bought it, and it didn't have a book behind it. And I realized that if I was going to write an exorcism story, I needed to find something that people had as much faith in as they had in religion. Something, because now people just don't believe the way they did in, say, 1971 when The Exorcist was published. They don't have that religious faith that will save them from hell. Even people with deep religious faith, a lot of it's qualified. And then you start getting into, since the culture wars of the 90s, you start getting into very weird political territory. And I wanted to avoid that. And I thought the other thing that people have faith in is friends. They're friends. And especially when you're in high school is when a lot of those friendships seem strongest. It's one of those times when you feel like what gets you through the day, that life and death connection with someone, are your friends. I know for me, my friends saved me numerous times. Both from almost dying a couple of times and also kept me sane and enrolled in school and not getting expelled. And friendship was so fraught. In high school, friendship runs so hot. And a lot of those people who are so close to you, where that friendship is so hot, so passionate, where you can't imagine getting through the next day without them. High school ends, you may see them 1 or 2 more times, and then never again for the rest of your life. You have those friendships when you need them, and then they go away. And I wanted to look at adult friendships because they last much longer, but they run much cooler. I know that in high school, if someone didn't like, say, Duran Duran's Arena album, that would be an issue. That would be a real serious problem between how can we stay friends? If they thought Pink Floyd was stupid and pretentious, how could we cope? We didn't like the same band. As an adult, I have friends who are radically different politically from me, lifestyle. I mean, people I would not have given the time of day as a teenager are my friends. And I think one of the things that happens with adults is these friends are the ones who will do more for you. They're the ones who will be there when you get divorced. They will be there when a child dies. They may literally loan you the money that keeps you from losing your house. They may quite literally save your life or your child's life. That's something a high school friend's going to do as much as likely as an adult friend. And adult friendships are going to last longer. And one of the bargains, though, with adult friendship is toleration. I'll put up with your BS if you put up with mine. I'll put up with your annoying parts of your character if you'll put up with the annoying parts of my character. And so adult friendship turns out to be a lot more about tolerating someone and a lot more about the long haul. And I realized when I looked at my mom's book club, which has been around for 40 something years, their friendship was based around books. And there was certainly nothing to laugh at with that. I know a lot of people have this image of a book club, a bunch of silly women reading dumb books, but good God, someone wants to see their life through books and center a lot of their life around books. I can't see anything to make fun of about that. I mean, to me personally, it makes more sense than centering your life around football season. And when that book club has been around for long enough, these people have been a part of your life for as many years, you start to realize that that's the network, that when something goes wrong, those are the people you're going to turn to. And in the book, two things do go wrong. The first thing that goes wrong is the 90s. I decided to set this book in the 90s because I'd set my best friend's exorcism in 1988 because that was when I was in 10th grade and my main characters were in 10th grade. But I wanted to set this book a little further ahead, and I was curious about the 90s because it's when I was in university. And the 90s is famously the decade when, quote, nothing happened. And we largely think of the Clinton years as this sort of, yes, there was impeachment and all this stuff, but, you know, the economy was doing great. You know, the Cold War was over. It was sort of a big, long snooze. But when you look back at the 90s, you realize something happened there. You look at the early 90s, and, well, actually, you look at the early 90s and you look at, say, Walmart. Early 90s, Walmart's in 39 states. They employ a few 100,000 people. They make about $250 billion a year. Or no, sorry, $250 million a year, roughly, in revenue. You look at Walmart at the end of the 90s, they are the largest private employer in the world. They make billions a year in revenue. They are huge. There are Walmarts everywhere. You look at the early 90s and you look at the late 90s, you see basically the first World Trade Center attack, the first impeachment of president since Watergate. It's the first time we were introduced to Hillary Clinton. CNN begins to introduce 24-hour news. Fox goes on the air. I think towards the end of the decade, MSNBC. There's the O.J. Simpson trial in the middle. Suddenly reality television appears. There's that 24-hour news cycle. The banking industry is deregulated, which results in the 2008 economic crisis. We are introduced to so many people we come back to again and again now. So much. It's our first war in Iraq. So much of what's going on now has its roots in the 90s, and even more so for women. At the beginning of the 90s, the Riot Girl movement was going on. There was also every female singer-songwriter, from Beyonce and Destiny's Child to Celine Dion to, I think, Amy Grant to Sinead O'Connor to Alanis Morissette, Jewel, Ani DeFranco. Everyone was releasing their first album in the late 80s, early 90s. In the early 90s, you had the Women's March for Life on Washington, or no, sorry, March for Women's Lives on Washington, which is 500,000 people marching for reproductive rights on Washington, D.C., carried on TV, aired live. You had in the early 90s the huge wave of women come into Congress, the most women elected to government ever, based off the back of the Clarence Thomas hearings and the treatment of Anita Hill. And then you get to the end of the 90s. A lot of those women have lost their congressional seats. Music is boy bands like New Kids on the Block and sort of cock rock like Kid Rock and Limp Bizkit. Rap and hip hop have gotten super, super hardcore and macho. You look at the fact that so many of those women who lost their seats, lost them in the culture wars. You look at doctors who perform abortions being shot in their front yards, at their clinics being bombed. You look at the fact that porn is suddenly mainstream. At some point in the 90s, topless bars began to be franchised and go out everywhere. You look at sort of the #1 pose for women that you see in magazines towards the late 90s, early 2000s is wearing a suit, smoking a cigar, holding a glass of scotch. There's this enormous pressure on women to get along, to be one of the guys, to think it's ironic to go to a strip club, to think porn is comfortable and something that they're okay with. And maybe they are, but it's an enormous amount of pressure brought to bear on women. Something happened in the 90s. Something happened to us. Something happened to women. Something happened when you look at the fact that it's when Hillary Clinton began to be demonized. You look at the fact that the O.J. Simpson trial put Nicole Brown Simpson on the back burner and became instead about the celebrity O.J. standing there at the front of the courtroom trying on that glove. You look at Lorena Bobbitt, the victim of a domestic abuse turned into a tabloid punchline. What happened to us in the 90s? Why did we get so heartless? And one of the things that happened is that we were making so much money. You look at the growth of wealth and even the growth of the gap in income inequality in the 90s, just growing hand over fist, the stock market, everything getting bigger and bigger, the banks getting deregulated. And there was this attitude in the 90s that if you didn't like something, if you wanted to point to something and say, that's wrong, that's racist, that's sexist, whatever it is, maybe we shouldn't be sending troops to this country. The response was, shh, don't mess it up. Don't rock the boat. We're all making a lot of money because money made it all better. How could we be wrong when we were getting so rich? How could our decisions, we won the Cold War. We won the Gulf War. We were making so much money. We were so validated. We had closed the hole in the ozone layer. We were invulnerable. And as we saw on 9/11, 2001, we weren't invulnerable. We were just as vulnerable as everyone else. But for a while, that sense of invulnerability made us reckless and made us careless and made us heartless. And for me, someone asked me when I was originally going to write this book, I actually tried to write it many years ago, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and I went to my editor to sell it, and they said, okay, yeah, sure. They weren't wild about it. And I started writing it. And about 6 weeks in, after they had okayed it, I got a phone call from my editor that said, you know, you can write this book if you want to. I'm not going to stop you, but sales and marketing aren't wild about it. And I'll tell you as an author, the last thing you want to hear is sales and marketing aren't wild about it, because it means no one's wild about it. It means your editor doesn't want you to write it, because if no one wants to sell that book or market that book's going to die alone on the side of the road, and no one's going to love it and no one's going to care. And so I asked, why weren't they wild about it? And they said, well, first off, their feeling is, who wants to read a book about a bunch of middle-aged women, housewives? And I thought, well, I don't know a lot of people. And then the second thing they said was, second off, vampires. Who cares? And so at that point, I knew this book wasn't going to happen. I went and I wrote a book called We Sold Our Souls. And then I came back and wrote this one. And I think I wrote Paperbacks from Hell in there somewhere. But when I came to write this book, I'd always instinctively knew it would be about vampires, but I didn't know how or why, because let's face it, vampires, there's too many of them. We're all sick and tired of vampires. And I started to wonder, you know, what would make a vampire scary? And I started to think about The Bridges of Madison County, because I've been obsessed with that book for a really long time. And because to me, it's a book about a serial killer. The guy who is the star of the book, he's played by Clint Eastwood in the movie, he goes to this small town, comes in, no one knows where he's from, wearing jeans, rolls up in an old beat up pickup truck. He's there to take pictures. No one knows where he comes from. No one knows where he's going. He shacks up with this woman there, Francesca. And there's a whole thing about how he has to be very careful that people don't know he's with her. He has to hide his truck. No one can know that he's at her house. Then he takes her upstairs and they do things to each other. And then he slips away and leaves town and no one ever sees him again or knows how to get in touch with him anymore. And I thought, my God, he's a serial killer. That's the MO. That's that American icon, right? The cowboy, Shane, the man with no name. We don't know where he comes from. We don't know where he's going. He's got the heart of a poet. He's grizzled. He's good looking. He's wearing blue jeans and cowboy boots. He has maybe a guitar on his back and poetry in his soul. And he blows into town, changes a bunch of women's lives, and then drifts away on the winds. And that's also Ted Bundy. That's also Henry Lee Lucas. That's also the serial killer. And that American icon, that rootless loner, that can be Jack Kerouac. That could be Bob Dylan, that could be John Wayne, or that could be these other guys. And I started to think about how a serial killer, he's the monster who moves among us. I think that's what we're so attracted to about why we're fascinated. And that's the vampire. I mean, zombies smell bad, werewolves get hairy during their time of month and run around like crazy people. Frankenstein's monster is made of dead body parts and doesn't have much in the way to offer in conversation. Ghosts just sort of rattle chains, but a vampire looks like us. And except for a few restrictions, he can move amongst us and we can't tell the difference. And I started to think that a vampire and a serial killer, they're both predators and they're both heartless. To them, people are not people. They're fuel for their fantasies. They're cattle, they're prey. And I started to wonder, if you have to make a decision with vampires, whether they're gonna be supernatural or not, and I chose not. So my vampire can't turn into fog or a bat or what happens to the mask. They can't drink blood to live because the human blood supply only has 6,000 to 8,000 calories in it, and that's not enough to take you for more than a few days. And are you gonna be killing someone every couple of days? That's an easy way to get found out. And I started to think, what would a vampire be doing if he could walk amongst us and live for hundreds of years? And I started to think, in the early 90s, a vampire who is smart would start to look around and think, the world's getting smaller and smaller, and there are more and more security cameras everywhere. And we all have to show more and more photo ID whenever we go anywhere. And there's more file sharing and computerized file sharing between different jurisdictions, different states, different law enforcement divisions. And a smart vampire would sit down and think, it's time I put down some roots. It's time I got a driver's license. It's time I got a deed to a house, a social security number. It's time I got a bank account and fit in somewhere. Because if you don't have a birth certificate, how are you going to get any of that stuff? And a smart vampire would look around and say, where am I going to do that? Where's somewhere that people will take me at face value and not ask too many questions? And I had an answer right there, Mount Pleasant. Where else would a white guy with a certain amount of money who presented in a certain charming, educated way be more likely to be taken at face value than my hometown? And where else would a guy who's white and well-to-do be allowed so much leeway to do anything as in the 90s? Especially if he could help other people make money. And for this potential vampire, they would also have one other benefit, which is he could look around and see the way Mount Pleasant is split up. At least it was in the 90s. It's a little less split up that way now. But he would see that there were a lot of Black people living out on 17 and up Rifle Range Road. And he would feel, gosh, as long as I prey on them and their children and stay away from the well-to-do white people, this is really a no-lose situation for me. Who's going to take them seriously? Who's going to take them losing some kids? Who's going to care? It's a heartless calculation, but it was a calculation a lot of people made back then. And I think it's a calculation a lot of people still make. And what James Harris doesn't count on when he moves to Mount Pleasant is he sees these women around him, these housewives, these Southern housewives in a book club, and he takes them at face value. And he never looks further beneath the surface. And what he doesn't realize is, at least when I was growing up, For a lot of houses, almost everyone I knew, everyone at that house, especially the women who were there during the day, interacted with an African-American woman or man every day. It was someone who took care of their yard. It was someone who took care of their kids. It was someone who cleaned their house. It was someone who did for them, as we said. It was someone who took care of their aging parent who lived with them. And even though these relationships were complicated by race and class and so many other factors, despite itself, we as human beings have a need to connect with each other, and friendships, real friendships, broke out. We were around each other for so many years, involved with each other's lives so much. We knew each other's families. We knew whose kid was getting into trouble and whose kid was on the dean's list. We knew when people were graduating and when people were sick. We went to each other for help. And that's what James Harris doesn't count on, that these women know each other. And more than that a mom may be white, she may be well-to-do, but to her, a kid, even the kid of a poor Black woman, is still a kid. And moms don't like to see kids get hurt. And so despite all the complications of race and class and those complications that go on today, even if you just look at somewhere like Phillips right now, we are wrapped up in each other's lives in ways that don't appear on the surface, and in ways that let these women see trouble coming. And the fact that in the book I call the community 6 Mile out on Rifle Range Road, but I think we all know these unincorporated townships that exist up there out on 17 and Rifle Range Road. There's 8 Mile, there's 7 Mile. They go all the way. I don't know if Phillips is incorporated or not, but, and one of the things with these communities is they're very marginalized, but the first people to see trouble are the people on the margins. They're our early warning system. They're the people who deal with something, and we know sooner or later what they're dealing with, we're gonna have to deal with. Right now, you see that all over the world with global warming, as very marginalized communities in sub-Saharan Africa, as nomadic fishermen in Indonesia are facing migration and extinction level events with climate change. Those are our early warning system on the margins, and eventually we'll have to face that too. You see it with police brutality, as Black people are murdered by cops. And now we start to notice, oh, a 13-year-old kid with autism was just shot by the police. And more we realize it's not just their problem, it's all our problems. It just hit them first because they live on the margin, they live closer to the edge. They don't have the luxury of the money and the property to give themselves that buffer. And so by underestimating them, by taking these women at face value, James Harris makes this fatal flaw when he moves to Mount Pleasant. And one of the nice things about writing about Mount Pleasant and Charleston for me, and one of the reasons I find myself doing it more and more, is Charleston, I know it, for one hand, and the other is that Charleston's old. And because it's old, you wind up having a lot of symbols stacked up on top of each other, a lot of history piled up in weird arrangements, in weird patterns, because there's a limited amount of room and we have so much history that goes back so far, and we've cut so many sides of that history that the symbols begin to run up against each other in strange ways. You look at the fact that Denmark Vesey's statue and memorial, Denmark Vesey, a slave who historians feel was most likely framed, or actually he was a freed man, but was most likely, and a businessman, but a formerly enslaved worker who had bought his way out and set up a business and was doing well for himself, was framed most likely by other business owners who feared him for being free. And they use that as an excuse to introduce draconian race laws and to execute Denmark Vesey as well as many other enslaved workers. That the memorial to Denmark Vesey is in Hampton Park, named after Wade Hampton, a successionist governor who presided over South Carolina during the Civil War, who was one of the most virulent secessionists, and who also was elected governor in one of historically the most corrupt and bloodiest elections in American history, an election that saw around 147 African-American people murdered to keep them from voting and to terrorize other African-American people to stay away from the polls, that saw polling places surrounded by armed white men to keep them safe and secure, ensure the security of the election. An election that was so contested that for almost a year and a half, there were 2 South Carolina state legislatures ruling parallel, legislating in parallel, because the old one simply refused to accept the outcome of the election and continued to sit and legislate. When you look at Denmark Vesey statue in that park, you look at the way those symbols butt up against each other and reflect on each other, and you wonder, you know, is this driving the ghost of Denmark Vesey or the ghost of Wade Hampton more crazy? And so that's why I keep coming back to Charleston again and again to write about it, because the history of it, the way it is, the way it runs up against itself and steps on its own feet so often is so fascinating to see as a writer. Everything acquires meaning. There's no such thing in Charleston as a non-historic street. There's no such thing, as we've seen with Phillips and the Highway 41 expansion, is a highway that isn't paved over history. So I think you guys wanted to have a few minutes to have some questions, and I know I've probably talked enough. Are we doing questions, Jonathan? I wanted to double check on that.
Hey, Grady, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we will definitely take some questions, and while our audience thinks about whether or not they have any, let me go ahead and ask one. I bet that this book has brought you a readership that perhaps was not familiar with your earlier novels, that wouldn't self-identify as horror readers. And I'm curious specifically about the reaction from book clubs as they've read this book. Can you speak to that at all for us?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Listen, it was a calculated decision to use the word book club and Southern in the title of this book, because I knew that had appeal beyond the horror audience. I love the horror audience. I am the horror audience, but I wanted to reach more people than that. And one of the things that's been really fascinating is when I was talking about the response my editor had years ago to this book, who wants to read about a bunch of middle-aged housewives? The answer to that now, and the reaction to that now, is so radically different. Before this book came out, when it was still in galleys, it went out to LA and got wrapped up in a big auction for the TV rights. And a lot of people were bidding on it to make it a TV series. Amazon wound up with it and is developing it now. But one of the things people kept saying to me was, we want this book because the characters in it are our viewers. They're just regular people. They're Americans. They're in their 30s and their 40s. They're mostly women. They have kids. They live in the suburbs. These are normal people. You know, and that's really, I find that you see so much literary fiction, you know, the standard cliche is it's a college professor with their marriage falling apart at some East Coast or West Coast school. And that's such a tiny fraction of human existence. And one of the really nice things of this book is book clubs have embraced it and read it. Some of them just, they're curious about the title, others because they recognize themselves in it or have someone who recognizes them in it and recommend it. It's been really nice to see people recognize themselves in this and have a hero moment, because these women, you know, they get to be heroes in this book. They're not just jokes. They're not just, oh, and then my kids got married. They actually get to stand up and fight for something. And it's been really amazing because I know a lot of these women, and I know a lot of people, you get into your 40s, you get into your 50s, you've been in a lot of fights. You've had to stand up. You've taken your hits. And it's nice for a book to come out that kind of pins a medal on you for it. And that's really been the reaction I've seen a lot, which has been really, really nice. The problem with it is they'll often say, well, what else should I read? And I so worry that my taste isn't always their taste. So I'm like, what other horror novels would I like? And so I find myself recommending Shirley Jackson an awful lot.
I just want to say how much I only started the beginning of your book, where you talk about the lady that she's supposed to be the leader and she had.
Oh, right.
That was hysterical. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Her soul up to heaven. She's sitting in the room. It was great.
Well, you know, it's one of those funny things, right? There's a great book by Anne Rivers Siddons. And, you know, she's mostly thought of as a writer who writes about families and women in the South, but she wrote a great horror novel in the early 80s, I think, called The House Next Door. And one of the things that I love about that book is that it takes place in sort of the Atlanta suburbs, and these people, they have this, like, they got new money and they want to build a house, and they get an architect and he builds them this modern masterpiece, and there's just something wrong with the house. And instead of being a haunting that I think we've all seen, we're all tired of blood running down the walls and swarms of flies and ghosts in the attic. We've all seen that, right? Like, we can handle that. That's what Febreze was made for. But this house shames people. It sort of ferrets out their deepest shame and then sort of exposes it to people. And their shame and humiliation makes them kill themselves or go nuts. And it's one of those things, like, it starts in the book with Patricia so mortified. She hasn't read this book and walking into this situation that she knows is going to go badly for her. But I find that, shame is one of those things that I'm the most horrified about. Like, people always ask, well, what scares you, horror writer? And I mean, the number one thing is being broke, but the number two thing is being embarrassed, being humiliated. Like, that's just appalling. I was talking to a book club once. There was a big one down in San Antonio. It's about 100 people. And someone said, that's not true. People like, they don't like to be embarrassed and all that, but like, people like, they'll get over it. But like, if you get killed or your arm gets torn off or you get a disease, that's worse. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. I said, so why don't you, and we were doing this remotely, so it was more a metaphorical thing, but it was more illustrative. I was like, so leave me with your laptop. Let me see your browser history without you getting a chance to edit it. Let me read your email. Like, we will sit down and tell people our life stories. We will sit down and say, my mom was crazy. Or let me tell you the story about this time my dad got really drunk and got on the riding lawnmower. But letting someone look through our email, our drafts folder, letting someone look at our browser history, like, are you kidding me? So we're happy to tell our story when we've curated it and edited it, but letting someone else see the raw us, no way. That's a deep fear I think everyone can identify with.
But I'm pretty sure my browser history is okay. Here's what's like. Mine is full of showers and tile.
Yeah, but I bet your draft email folder. Those are always full of those emails we write and never send and forget to delete. You write it to get it out of your system.
Right.
Well, Grady, let me ask another question here.
Sure.
What's it been like pushing a horror novel during a pandemic?
Oh, it's been great. So my publisher made this choice to stick with I think it was April 7th was my pub date, which seems like 5 years ago now. And I was really, really happy they stuck with it, because at the time you're like, what do we do? And everyone's saying, oh, we'll reschedule your event for July, or we'll reschedule for everything will be done by June. It'll all be fine. I was really glad they stuck with that date, because it was early enough in the pandemic that people were still like looking for something to do and, oh, I should read more and all that, but not late enough that everyone started holding on to their money and being like, I'm not sure how long this is going to go. Maybe books I'll put on hold. I can get, grab and go at the library. And also not late enough to be in this traffic jam right now that's been going on since July with publishing. You've got an election coming up, so you've got like everyone publishing like a big political book every week. And then you've got this traffic jam of the regular books that were coming out in fall, and now all these books that have been pushed to fall. So I'm really glad it was early. And to be honest, Zoom burnout is real. It's very hard to do these events and not be in a room with y'all. Like, I get so much energy from talking to people, and you get a sense for their body language and when people are rolling their eyes or staring off into the distance, waiting to die or for you to stop talking. But you also get that back and forth, and it's so unnatural on these platforms. But it's also been really cool to be able to be like sort of at a book club in North Dakota, at a book club in Florida, at a book club in San Antonio, at many book clubs in North Carolina. I don't know what's up with North Carolina. Like, they have so many more bookstores in South Carolina and so many book clubs. It's crazy. I don't know. Maybe it's all the colleges. I can't tell. But I always feel bad because South Carolina, I usually do Columbia, Charleston, and then go down to maybe Beaufort and Port Royal, NeverMore Books and all that. And that's it. North Carolina, it's like 7 or 8 cities I make stops at. It's very weird. South Carolina, pick up your game. Although I did get to, I was talking to the people who are producing the Southern Book Club TV show. And we were having this Zoom call and they kept calling it North Carolina, North Carolina. Finally, I'm like, listen, man, you got to stop. I was like, South Carolina is the South Korea to North Carolina's North Korea. They are our ancient enemies. We want nothing to do with them. Like, we are all about freedom and they are all about weird mountains and winding country road and too many jug bands and mandolin players on street corners in Asheville. But I think they came away from that thinking that like South Carolina and North Carolina might actually be at war. I was pretty adamant about it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Hendrix, for joining us, and
Yeah.
thank you everyone in person and everyone watching virtually for joining us for our Lowcountry Book Club convention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. And can I just say one quick thing? Sorry, because I want to do this live at some point, but I also wanted to say, you know, I'm really glad NeverMore is there selling books. And if you bought a book from them today, buy two. This really is an extinction level event for independent bookstores. I love Amazon. I just got a package from Amazon today. Amazon will be here next year. Independent bookstores might not. And in Charleston, we had an independent bookstore called Chapter 2 downtown. And when we lost it, we didn't have another one for almost 10 years. When these stores go, they don't always come back. So please support your local indie bookstore. And thank you guys for listening.